hey, domain is all of the numbers you are allowed to plug into a function. Maybe you're thinking, wait, there are some numbers I might not be allowed to plug in. That's right. You're not allowed to plug in anything that makes the function undefined. Now, there's basically only four ways a function can be undefined. So that means there's only four things you need to look out for when trying to find the domain. Do you know what those four things are? Here they are: division by zero, square root of negative numbers, logarithm of negative numbers, or zero. And finally, maybe the function is undefined just because I say so. So let's talk about all those things in detail. So first up, division by zero. Actually, we already talked about this in the previous video, right? If you haven't watched it, link is in the description. But we looked at this function here. This is like the simplest example. We plugged in zero and it didn't work because we can't divide by zero, right? So this was undefined and that had an effect on the domain. So just keep in mind that division by zero can make your domain weird. All right, next up, square root of negative numbers. So let's use this function as our example because this is like the simplest example. What would happen if we tried to plug negative numbers, like for example, -1 into this function? Would it work? No, it would not work. So we are not allowed to plug negative numbers into this function. And the reason why it doesn't work is because we are not allowed to square root negative numbers. Square rooting negative numbers is impossible, assuming we're only using real numbers. And we are only using real numbers. So let's make sure we're all on the same page here, okay? X and f of x have to be real. They have to be real numbers. Maybe you've heard of imaginary numbers or complex numbers, but we're not using those for these domain problems. If we tried to use those, these problems would get way too advanced, like too advanced for the algebra level or pre-calculus level. So we cannot do the square root of negative numbers. That is undefined. But could we do the square root of like 9, for example? Of course, we could do the square root of 9, right? That's 3. And we could even plug 0 in here. That would be 0. So I think negative numbers are the only thing we are not allowed to plug in. I think negative numbers are the only thing we are not allowed to do the square root of. So the domain here is going to be everything other than negative numbers. We are allowed to plug in anything other than negative numbers. Okay, let's move on to logarithms now. And if you haven't learned about logarithms yet, that's fine. Just ignore what I'm about to say. You can skip a minute ahead in the video. All right, so let's use log x as our function because that's like the simplest one to use. What would happen if I tried to plug negative numbers into the function, such as -1? It would not work. You cannot do the log of negative numbers, okay? That is undefined. What would happen if I try to plug 0 into this function? It would not work as well because I cannot do the log of 0. That is undefined. But what about like the log of 10? Well, yeah, I can do that. That would just be 1. I could even do like fractions, right? If I plugged 1/100th into here, then yeah, that would be -2. So yeah, I think that negative numbers and 0 are the only things I am not allowed to plug in here. I think those are the only things I cannot do the logarithm of. So the domain here is going to be everything other than negative numbers and 0. I am allowed to plug in everything other than negative numbers and 0. And actually, that's the same thing as just positive numbers, right? Yeah, everything other than negative numbers and 0 is just a wordy way of saying positive numbers. So this is a much simpler way of saying it. Oh, by the way, I have a whole video on domain of logarithms. So I'll link that in the description. In that video, I do explain why you cannot do the log of negative numbers and why you cannot do the log of 0. So you might find that video interesting. Okay, so actually, we can be more specific here. Remember, I said that x and f of x for all of these domain problems will always be real numbers. So we can actually be more specific. Instead of saying like positive numbers here, why not say instead positive real numbers, positive real numbers. It's just a little bit extra detail. Or instead of saying everything other than negative numbers and zero, why not say like real numbers, all real numbers other than negative numbers and zero? That's just a little bit more specific. And same thing for the square root domain. Instead of saying everything, let's say all real numbers. So it's all real numbers other than negative numbers. And I'll even go back to this one here. And this might seem like I'm splitting hairs or something, but I mean, it is actually important to be specific because, like we were saying before, we're not using imaginary numbers and complex numbers. So it is important to specify like what numbers we are using here. Okay, so we talked about 3 of the 4 things that you have to look out for when finding domain. We talked about division by 0. We talked about square root of negative numbers. We talked about logarithm of negative numbers or 0. There's only one last thing to talk about. Maybe the function is undefined just because I say so, right? So if I create a function, or let's say you create a function, okay? You get to decide where the function is defined and where the function is undefined. It's actually up to you. So we'll talk about that in the next video because I want to keep these videos short. So link to the next video is in the description. Thanks for watching.